On February 10, 2009, the residents of Ridgewood, Queens, New York were going about their usual daily activities when their afternoon took a sinister turn. A 64-year-old man named Rosario Prestigiacomo was found viciously stabbed to death, with his blood plastered all over his home's walls. The detectives at the scene were left with numerous unanswered questions, not realizing how long the investigation would stretch. After 15 years of tireless investigation, the detectives finally cracked the case with the help of advanced forensic genealogy and an unexpectedly crucial piece of evidence: a used fork. Around 2:15 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, the New York Police Department received a distress call from Ridgewood, a neighborhood in Queens, New York. The 911 call came from a concerned neighbor who had been hearing unusual noises from a nearby house all afternoon. The neighbor described the sounds as resembling a struggle between two people and urged the authorities to investigate. It didn't take long for the police officer to arrive at the described two-story house located at 2031 Green Avenue Street in Ridgewood. The officer had repeatedly called out to the resident to let him in, but there was still no response, so he decided to go in himself by accessing the house through the first-floor window. Once the officer entered the house, he was greeted with a horrific scene. A deceased man was found lying face down in a pool of his own blood. The initial investigations showed that he had been viciously stabbed about 16 times in the neck, torso, face, and limbs. The attack was so gruesome that the man's blood was splattered all over the walls of his home, making the residence look like a bloody butcher's shop. An alarming amount of blood was also present in the hallway, and the forensics team was immediately called to analyze the ghastly crime scene and gather evidence. After the secure perimeter had been set up and access to the property restricted to only the authorized personnel, the entire crime scene was documented with accurate sketches and photographs. Both the sketches and photographs taken by forensics captured the exact position of the victim's body was found, the numerous blood splatters both on and around the corpse, along with other potentially incriminating evidence found throughout the house. When the documentation of the crime scene had been completed, the forensic team began to gather and collect evidence. Unsurprisingly, the majority of the evidence they were able to acquire were blood samples. In addition to the blood samples, they collected blood swabs from the hallway, cloth fibers, hairs, and fingerprints from all locations in the house. They also retrieved the fingernails of the victim and any potential weapons they could find in the vicinity. The forensic team soon finished the evidence collection, and the only thing left was to carefully study the corpse before sending the victim's body over to the medical examiner. During their examination, forensics found that in addition to the clear stab wounds recorded by the first responders at the scene, there was also extreme damage to the victim's chest, esophagus, lungs, and abdomen, all marked with visceral puncture wounds. A detailed report from both the first responders and the forensic team was sent over to the chief medical examiner, who confirmed most of their findings. However, he uncovered something new during his extensive examinations. He had noticed several blunt force injuries on the victim's head and torso, which appeared to have been inflicted with a shovel. This detail coincided with one of the probable weapons gathered as evidence by the forensics team. While the detectives didn't find the knife or dagger they believed was the murder weapon, one of the potential weapons used during the attack that was retrieved at the crime scene was a bloody shovel. The presence of these blunt force traumas also indicated a struggle had taken place before the attacker stabbed him to death. A further analysis by the chief medical examiner revealed even more incriminating evidence, mainly found in the blood samples. They would give the detectives the first trace of their escaped killer. The chief medical examiner had created DNA profiles from the blood samples retrieved by the forensics team and the crime scene detectives during his examination. While examining the DNA obtained from the blood swabs, he noticed that apart from the DNA of the victim, there existed the DNA of an unknown male. After a few more tests, the medical examiner was convinced that the foreign DNA profile belonged to the killer. Additional analysis also showed that some of the blood samples with the foreign DNA were retrieved from under the victim's fingernails. This led the chief medical examiner to theorize that the unidentified DNA might have gotten there when the victim scratched or injured his assailant while attempting to escape, avoid the barrage of attacks, and fight back. The detective's initial approach to identifying the DNA sample was to put the unidentified sample into the local police DNA database and cross-check the profile with any suitable matches. It really seemed like the detectives had already solved the case at this point, as all they needed to do now was to wait for the DNA profile to be identified by the database. Unfortunately for the detectives, this was where the first major challenge popped up in their investigation, as no matches were found for the unidentified DNA. Despite the initial setback, the detectives weren't willing to give up that easily. Over the course of the investigation, the unidentified DNA profile was placed into several other local, state, and even national DNA databases and databanks. But no matter how many times they tried, or how many DNA databases they used, the detectives weren't able to identify the foreign DNA. And it wasn't long before it started to look like the victim's cold-blooded killer didn't even exist. To speed up the identification process of the elusive killer, the detectives went to interrogate and question the victim's neighbors to see what they knew about him and if they'd seen anything that night. One particular neighbor, whose name was Sam Shaheen, told the detectives that he had met Prestigiacomo on numerous occasions as he used to frequent the deli he owned, located at the corner of Green and Grandview Avenues. During his interview, Shaheen further described Prestigiacomo as an elderly Italian landlord who was very quiet and didn't talk much. He then said that their block on Green Avenue, Ridgewood, was also quiet, and they never heard or witnessed any bizarre noises coming from his home until that Tuesday afternoon. A woman who referred to herself as Mama Teresa told the detectives that she was one of the oldest residents in Ridgewood, and she had been living in the neighborhood for over 54 years. She told the detectives that while they weren't common, she had seen some violent acts over the years, recalling an incident when another man who lived in the neighborhood was stabbed for his necklace. However, when she was asked by the detectives if she had ever witnessed any violent acts that happened around Prestigiacomo in the past, she said no. She further described him in the same way Shaheen did, saying Prestigiacomo was a calm person who kept to himself. There was also no evidence that he had been involved in any violent or strange acts while he had been living in the neighborhood. After they had finished questioning all of Prestigiacomo's neighbors, the detectives didn't get anything on the killer, as no one could identify his assailant. With the detectives still having no solid leads on the identification of the foreign DNA, they decided to use a different tactic and look into the background of the victim, hoping they could potentially find some leads that would help them finally solve the case. The detectives had already identified the victim as Mr. Rosario Prestigiacomo. He was a 64-year-old man who was known to be a very reserved and quiet individual. The detectives had also spoken to all of his neighbors in Ridgewood, Queens, and each of them described him as a private but very friendly individual. The detectives then decided to look for clues elsewhere in his past as they tried to build a timeline leading to his murder. During their investigations, they found out that Prestigiacomo, who had been divorced from his ex-wife, had been living alone during the latter years of his life. Not much was uncovered about his career, apart from Shaheen's information that he was a landlord. However, due to the fact that he had been a long-time resident of the neighborhood, the investigators believed he might have already retired or was working locally. The last thing the investigators uncovered about the victim was that despite Prestigiacomo's reserved nature, he was still a well-known and well-respected figure in his local community. He was liked by all his neighbors, and none of them had anything bad or negative to say about him. All this information made the investigation even more challenging for the detectives, as they racked their brains trying to figure out who would want to ruthlessly murder a well-respected and polite 64-year-old man in a quiet neighborhood. It proved impossible for the detectives to answer these questions as time went by. Everything they uncovered in his background kept leading them to dead ends. And despite their redoubled efforts, no government databases could identify him through his DNA profile. The NYPD detectives continued to try everything they could to solve the case. But at the rate the investigation was going, it slowly started to look like their burning questions on the killer's identity and his motive would never be answered. As the months continued to pass by, the efforts put into solving the ghastly murder case of Rosario Prestigio Como slowly dwindled. A solution to the case seemed completely impossible at this point, and the numerous detectives and officers who had tirelessly worked on the murder case were pulled and assigned other cases. It wasn't long after that before the folder on the horrific homicide grew cold, with no answers to give to his grieving family. About 13 long years had passed since the homicide case of Rosario Prestigio Como had gone cold. However, while the case had grown even colder over the years, it had never been forgotten. In March of 2022, both the detectives from the Cold Case Squad and the Queens District Attorney's Office decided to follow up on the case using an entirely different approach than what was used by the detectives in 2009. Their new approach saw them using a bit of outside help to follow up and potentially solve the case, and the detectives found that help in a private laboratory called Othram. Othram was a private and pioneering laboratory located in Woodlands, Texas in the United States. They specialized in forensic genetic genealogy and the application of advanced forensic DNA technology to identify human remains and solve cold cases. The detectives also reached out to the United States Department of Homeland Security and asked them to help generate leads that could help identify the unknown suspect using forensic genetic genealogy. Both the Department of Homeland Security and Othram assisted the Cold Case Squad. And due to their joint assistance, the detectives were able to get a viable lead that could finally reveal the identity of the killer, who had managed to continuously escape their grasp for all these years. DNA technology had advanced rapidly over the years since Prestigio Como's homicide case had grown cold. The advancements in forensic genetic genealogy allowed the specialists at Othram Inc. to create a comprehensive genealogical profile from the blood samples that were retrieved from the crime scene, using advanced DNA testing on the unidentified DNA sample in June of 2022. Once the tests were over, the specialists at Othram uploaded the genealogical profile to public databases. And this was what the NYPD Cold Case Squad needed to finally move on to the next phase of the investigation. Investigator Linda Doyle, who was part of the NYPD's Forensic Investigations Division, built a family tree to identify any possible suspects or the relatives of a potential suspect using information from the now updated databases. It took her a while, but in December of 2023, Investigator Doyle handed over a lead to the NYPD and the District Attorney's Office. Working alongside each other, Detectives Francis Noonan and Matthew DeBonis of the NYPD's Cold Case Squad, who were working under the supervision of Sergeant James Wheeler, joined forces with the detectives from the District Attorney's Office. They tirelessly chased down the lead they had been given, and after extensive investigations and detective work, they finally put a face to the unidentified DNA profile. The man they believed was their prime suspect was named Anthony Scalici. A thorough investigation was carried out into the man Anthony Scalici, and it was revealed that the 41-year-old man was the nephew of Rosario Prestigio Como. He was the son of Prestigio Como's ex-wife's brother, a revelation that had baffled the entire NYPD department. The detectives quickly tracked him down to Boynton Beach, Florida. However, even after finding his current whereabouts, they still needed indisputable proof. Then the only way they could get that was by acquiring some of Anthony Scalici's DNA. Detectives Marco Viari and Aramis Gregorian of the Detective Bureau were assigned a surveillance operation that occurred on various days throughout the months of January and February of 2024. They were assisted by the Boynton Beach Police Department, which were working under the supervision of Sergeant Corey Henry, in addition to the United States Department of Homeland Security. The detectives carefully followed Anthony Scalici's movements through the surveillance operation, and on February 17, 2024, they managed to successfully acquire a used fork that Anthony Scalici had discarded. Anthony Scalici's fork was analyzed by the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner under the supervision of Lisa Mertz, who was the Assistant Director of the NYPD Cold Case Squad. After the analysis, the medical examiner was able to produce a DNA profile. This profile was sent for DNA testing, and it perfectly matched the unknown DNA profile that was found under Prestigio Como's fingernail and in various other retrieved blood samples that were left at the gruesome crime scene. With no doubts left in their minds, the NYPD's Regional Fugitive Task Force, with assistance from the United States Marshals and the Boynton Beach Police Department, arrested 41-year-old Anthony Scalici on May 14, 2024. New DNA enhancements led them to Anthony Scalici, who was arrested in Florida. He is identified as the suspect's nephew through marriage. Scalici was then extradited to New York to face charges on May 29, 2024. Anthony Scalici was arraigned on May 30, 2024 in the Queens Supreme Court. He was charged with second-degree murder for the killing of his 64-year-old uncle, Rosario Prestigio Como. Scalici's lawyer, attorney David Cohen, told the court that his client had pleaded not guilty that Thursday morning. The prosecutor for the case was Assistant District Attorney Karen L. Ross, who is the chief of the Cold Case Unit and Deputy Bureau Chief of the Homicide Bureau as of 2024. Attorney Ross is being assisted by Assistant District Attorney Veronica Proto-Pregora. Justice Kenneth Holder, who presided over Anthony Scalici's arraignment on May 30, 2024, has scheduled his next court appearance for July 8, 2024. Anthony Scalici is being held in jail at Rikers Island until July 8th and faces up to 25 years to life in prison if he is convicted. Queens District Attorney Melinda Katz, who was present during Scalici's arraignment, gave a statement to the press on the case saying, "I formed a cold case unit to bring closure to grieving families and seek justice on behalf of victims. This case is an example of the perseverance and determination of the investigators on this and every cold case, and highlights the successful partnership formed between my office and the NYPD Cold Case Squad. Defendants should not be able to evade justice no matter how much time has passed." The identification of Rosario Prestigio Como's killer has brought much-needed closure to Prestigio Como's family. The victim's daughter, Rosa Adele, gave a statement to the press on her father's homicide case, saying, "It's a real big shock. All this time he was right beneath us, and we didn't know it. Nobody had the right to kill my father. What Scalici did was disgusting. He should live a life of torment. I can't forget it. I can't. It's a bad dream, and we want to wake up and have my dad back." The victim's brother, Vincenzo Prestigio Como, also spoke to the press in a short video interview, expressing his thanks and gratitude to the investigators who relentlessly worked to bring his brother to justice.
This is double job. My father knows a man. Okay, thank you very much.
While the investigators were never able to find a motive behind Prestigio Como's tragic and terrifying murder, his family is still thankful that solving his murder has brought some relief to the emotional toll they have been bearing all these years. They also hope that this resolution will bring some closure. In the aftermath of the trial, the homicide case of Rosario Prestigio Como has had a significant impact on law enforcement and how future cases are solved. The identification of Prestigio Como's murderer marks the first use of forensic genetic genealogy to identify a suspect in a New York City homicide, and the detectives know it was only thanks to the use of that technology that the 15-year-long cold case was finally solved in 2024.